Y'all, I want to talk about something very interesting today. It's this concept of like war. Growing up, I saw all this like footage and stuff on the news. I watched the news sometimes at like 6 in the morning before I went to school if I woke up early. And I had no idea what was going on, but they would report on like Iraq and Afghanistan sometimes or whatever. And as a 6-year-old, really have no idea what's going on. But it kind of, makes you think like, okay, well, what if I was in their shoes at that time, right? What if I'm like 18 years old in the year 2002 or 3? And let's pretend the draft is still in effect. What if I got drafted for a war where I'm going to go fight overseas in one of those desert conflicts? And furthermore, what if you could like look back in time to someone who served in those wars in 2020 and ask them, would you go back in 2002 and serve again? And the obvious answer would probably be no at this point, right? Like, what the hell were we doing over there? What was victory? Who even knows? We spent all this money. We've put ourselves in such a terrible financial position today because we decided to go stick our dick in the Middle East with really no other objective than, I guess, oil and preventing weapons of mass destruction. Like, looking back, we all know that those wars are pretty much unjustified, right? So it gets you thinking, right? Okay, so if those wars are unjustified, were the wars before that justified? And it's kind of funny because when you're in high school, you learn a lot about World War I and World War II especially. And then, if you're lucky and you have a good teacher, this probably wasn't common in most other schools, but then you kind of go over the Korean War for maybe like a day or two. And then you get wind of like Vietnam, and for me in high school, at least junior year, when we were doing U.S. history, Vietnam was the last topic, and we took our final on that alone. So it's funny because that was probably 2015. There's like a 50-year gap almost between what I was learning about Vietnam and then life in 2015, right? So these kind of wars that were this in between part after Vietnam, but before Iraq, we have like no idea what's going on. We never learned anything about Iraq or Afghanistan, especially not 10 years after. But I think it would be fun to at least look at which wars we had been in since World War II and kind of give my thoughts about like should we have been fighting, what were the purposes of them. And it's not going to be a long video, but I want to at least put into consideration like the impacts of culture today. And like, if I was drafted to go to war today, for example, would I even go to war today for this government and this country at this time when it's so divided? And then you think about how stark that difference is between the World War II where people were turning 17 and trying to pretend like they were 18 years old so they could go fight across the seas in World War II. So without further ado, here's going to be a quick timeline of the wars that we've been in, and I'll just give my thoughts on them basically. So they're kind of broken down into 3 tiers. The first tier is Cold War or anti-communist conflicts. The next one is kind of these ones that I discussed. Late Cold War, early post-Cold War, small, fast interventions that we never hear about, especially as people born post-2000 and such. And then the third one is the 9/11 Forever Wars, which have gotten a lot of flack, especially in the last 5 or 10 years. We look at our $35 trillion debt, whatever it is, and we can trace back at least pretty much a third of that was thanks to the Bush Forever Wars. And so we go back up to the top, and we'll just quickly talk about the Cold War anti-communist conflicts. I guess I should probably start by saying World War II was like, justified, probably one of the most agreed upon things that the country has at this point, which is World War II was very much justified. We weren't necessarily going to get involved as an isolationist country until Japan bombed us, and then we went on both fronts to go fight in the Pacific and also Europe. So was it justified? Well, you have this person that's killing people in the Holocaust. He's putting people in prison. It's an extreme government. There was all sorts of government cartoon propagandas in the United States about this stuff, so it's not like people weren't unaware. And so we made one of the weirdest moves of all time. We became allies with the Soviet Union, really just because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if the enemy who's pretending to be my friend really isn't our friend whatsoever. And that became very clear in the Cold War. So World War II, you kind of have this high morale. People are like, all right, let's go fight for the country and go fight the Nazis and the Japanese. Then you get after World War II, Korea, of course, was divided because it was held by Japan. So the winners being the United States and the Soviet Union, and of course Britain, but really the US and Russia took the huge victory lap and were the main parties on the divided sides. Well, North Korea became the communist side and South Korea became the capitalist side. So China, having just been communist in 1949, didn't really have too much of a way to support, especially after World War II when they got totally just massacred by Japan. I mean, the U.S., of course, we lost 400,000 troops or so. I think it was like 420 or 440,000. But man, China and Russia were just on complete and total different levels of utter devastation. We are very lucky that we were able to just come back to our home, which was mainly untouched, China and Russia had completely different post-World War II experiences. And even during World War II, it was very different. We were basically just able to go over there, come back, and then they had to rebuild. I mean, the devastation the Soviet Union had was brutal. Now, it's important to note the Soviets weren't directly involved, or so it's said. But, they had Soviet tanks, they had Soviet planes, or I'm not exactly sure if they had an air force, but I thought they did. But I know for sure that the Koreans at least had tanks from the Soviets. So they made a move and they invaded South Korea. South Korea was completely unready to defend versus the North, which had support from the Soviets. Don't forget they were occupied by Japan, so they had literally nothing to themselves. So the U.S. steps in at the last second when they're on the peninsula, and the U.S. is able to mostly destroy the North Korean forces and push them all the way back to the Chinese River. And the Chinese saw that and said, oh, fucking hell no. So the Chinese got involved and they pushed the U.S. and they were able to push back the U.S. forces to the 38th parallel, which is pretty much what we see today as the border. China doesn't really want to get too involved and would rather have a buffer state like North Korea. And the U.S. didn't want to give up South Korea either and have one more ally for communists. And so, as you can see here, it ends in a stalemate and is technically still unfinished. So was Korea really like a justified war? Well, it was like an anti-communist war, right? We had the Truman Doctrine, which was basically like, communists, go fuck yourselves. We're going to stop this shit from happening all over the world. And it's ironic when we look at that in 2025 because we have communists in the country like full-blown. We just had a frigging communist mayor elected in New York. So Truman and, you know, the people of the old day from 80 years ago would look at this and be like, what the fuck just happened, you know? So these are two wars that, you know, are based on, you know, trying to prevent communist regimes from taking place and taking power in the government in those respective countries. Vietnam was more or less the same thing. And is it justified is a tough question. Is it really, is it justified for another country to stop another country from being communist and going down that rabbit hole? Because we know what happens with communism. That was the thing back in the day. Everybody knew communism, or at least most people knew communism was a terrible idea. More government power is horrible. You have to let individuals choose and make their own decisions rather than have the government make it for them. And they use these nice terms of like central planning, all this bullshit, but we all know that at the end of the day, socialism and big government is just terrible. At least that was the sentiment back in the day, right? So Vietnam was another instance where South Vietnam was, I think, the US one, and the capitalist system in the North were backed by the communists. It's another one of these. The North is trying to take over the South. Again, maybe I'm wrong about some of this. I'm doing this off memory now. I'm more familiar with the Korean War, ironically, than Vietnam at this point. But 1955 is a little bit ambitious of the year for us to really get involved. I thought it was more towards like the 60s with like Lyndon B. Johnson. And oh, look at that. I'm not actually that far off. It says direct combat from 65 to 73. So this is the difference between the Korean War, and I don't really have a great pulse on it because this is like a forgotten war in U.S. history. But the Vietnam War was very unpopular as time went on and on, right? So the sentiment again of should we be sending our boys over who are 18, 19, 20 years old to be fighting these communist regimes on the other side of the planet for the sake of preventing communism? It's tough to say, right? So this was like the sentiment at the time, is to prevent communism. We'll send our own boys and have American lives be taken at the expense to make sure that communism does not get a foothold in these countries. Direct combat is not allowed anymore because obviously if the U.S. invades Russia, they're just going to nuke us, and if Russia invades the U.S., well, we're just going to nuke them back. So that deterrent was huge, and at least the Soviets were smart enough to be like, okay, look, we'll kind of have this little truce here, at least. In the 60s, it did get kind of pretty close there, but nobody's nuked each other, and we're all still here, you know? Really just because if you try to nuke us, we'll nuke you back sort of a thing. And of course, this was also a very controversial war, right? So it's tough to answer whether we should be able to prevent communism in other countries. I'll get to this point later. So another thing is, I guess, this Lebanon 1958 and 1982 anti-Soviet alignment context in Dominican Republic preventing leftist takeover. I've never heard about this shit. I don't know what the hell this is, but I'm sure if ChatGPT saying it's important, it probably was. So the tier 2 is going to be this, and now it's funny about tier 2, right? I've never heard about anything about Grenada, Panama. I've heard a little bit about the Persian Gulf War and Somalia, maybe a trace amount. I've heard about this actually from a few days ago, the Black Hawk Down incident. But of these 4 wars, I mean, the Persian Gulf War would be the one we know most. But this was only a year. I mean, and really most of these wars are just like these tiny little conflicts we got involved with and didn't get much coverage. At least if you're born when I was born. These are all before I was born, so I don't know what the hell is going on with most of these, you know. Operation Desert Storm, and I guess that, you know, Saddam Hussein was an Iraqi invading Kuwait, and so we went to Kuwait to get him out of there or something like this. And that kind of ends up being important for Afghanistan and Iraq later. And again, you can kind of see that my knowledge of Iraq and Afghanistan is very limited, especially in the Middle East. My history of that region is really quite poor, but I'm like vaguely aware of some of these things. And guess what? As someone who's born in 1997, most of those things are prehistoric to me. So I really have to go out of my way to kind of look these things up. And this is just off the top of my head from what I've heard. So most of these wars are kind of like years and years later. They're not, the main shift here is they're not necessarily anti-communist in a big way the way the Korean and Vietnam War. Apparently this is only 1 year. I think this was a communist trying to get into power, maybe in Panama, I'm not really sure. Maybe he was a dictator. And of course, Operation Desert Storm was just to get Iraq out of Kuwait. And it was very successful in short, really because Iraq was using like really old tanks or whatever. And the US had developed such strong and updated technology that they just blew them out of the water, or the sand in that case. So these are not forever wars. And when we finally get to over here, Afghanistan, Iraq, and this whole fucking shitstorm of 2001 to 2021, and then us pulling out under Joe Biden, I mean, it took 20 years for us to close the door on George Bush's BS. We lost so many lives, how much money, and here's the main difference. What did we achieve by going over there? And I understand that this is a very common sentiment. This is like kind of well known. The Bush wars were kind of bullshit and achieved nothing, especially when they lied about having weapons of mass destruction. But, you know, we got oil out of it. Whoop-de-fucking-do. We sent our boys over there to, get slaughtered and killed? And what about us? We lost 3,000 people on 9/11, of course, but we went over there and destroyed the whole society, basically. 500,000 people, I think, died. Maybe it was 520,000 or something like that? And we have the audacity to say that this would be a justified war? Yeah, my ass. So, I don't really know. That's all freaking BS to me. And you can see the shift over here was that we were very anti-communist. I guess these are anti-communist as well, I didn't really know, to kind of these little 1 year off projects. Let's go have fun in the desert and do other dumb shit. But even this says it's overthrowing a Marxist leaning military government. I'm not really sure much about that. I never heard much about it. But when we get to over here, well, this is completely and totally unjustified. What the hell? And then even funnier, the Taliban returned to power at the end of it. So it was like, what do we even do? We just burnt a bunch of money. And now we have such horrible prices today. And now we have such a terrible dollar today because we decided to put it all on credit. So I guess I'm rambling a little bit about it, but the main point is, at what point do we say which war is justified, right? So let's pretend that Taiwan and China are going to have a serious conflict, right? China has had its eye on Taiwan for forever. That's where Chiang Kai-shek and his non-communists ran away to when Mao Zedong and them took over in 1949. Taiwan has basically been like the independent, free Republic of China, you could say. But the CCP has been basically getting more and more aggressive around them in the last year or two, especially. So it's been a very real thing, right? Like, what if Taiwan got invaded by China? Well, supposedly we have an agreement to go fight China on behalf of Taiwan over there, but is that something we really want to do? And furthermore, it comes back to this sentiment: do we really want to send our boys over there, myself included, to go fight in the war against China for Taiwan? Yes, it's anti-communist. Yes, we're trying to uphold another democracy or a non-communist state. But at the end of the day, we still have to use our capital and our men and our lives, put them over there on the line, all because communism is what people want. About a year ago, I had this conversation with someone where I was kind of like, I probably would go fight over, but, as time has gone on, it's like, well, I'm a single guy for now, but what if I do have a family? Am I really going to have the same sentiment? I mean, do I really want to go fight the Chinese, who are just going to outnumber us thousands of miles away, just to prevent communism in another society so they can benefit from it? It's like, well, when you put it like that, I mean, I don't really want to go fight another war, even if communism is what they end up having. It's terrible, and I would never wish it upon my worst enemy to have a communist society, but it's really more of a thing, well, it's their problem, because they didn't have the system and they didn't find a way to overcome it and find a way to overcome communism and put it in capitalism. Well, sorry, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. I don't want to have to spend all my money. And apparently these conflicts that were in the mid-'80s that we never hear about cost actually a fair amount of money, even if we didn't talk about them much. Do I want to spend my life, put my life on the line, spend my money in taxes just so that I can prevent it? Sorry, I don't think I do. And it's really kind of messed up, but we have to try to preserve what we have in our society right now. I mean, Russia fighting Ukraine. How many fucking people thought oh yeah, we need to stand with Ukraine? It's like, hold on a minute. You mean to tell me that I need to be sending my tax dollars over there when our country is in shambles as it is, and it's going down the slippery slope with the culture as it is right now? I'm sorry, I don't think that's appropriate. We should go send our boys over there. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? That's not even anti-communist. That's just fighting. That's one corrupt group of people fighting another corrupt group of people. That's one of the worst things we can have. That's not that different from the Afghanistan wars. So yeah, I don't want to put my capital and hard labor into that war either. Of the two, I would rather go fight in Taiwan, I guess, than fight against Putin and Russia and trying to uphold Ukraine. I would rather fight the CCP, I guess, but at the end of the day, do I really want to be someone to serve? Especially, and here's the main question that I've forgotten to put, and I should probably have put this earlier, is, well, okay, if I'm fighting on the front lines with my brothers, and when you're in the armed forces or whatever, you're supposed to have a brotherly bond with them. You're supposed to be able to rely on them, and no man left behind, right? If someone's in serious trouble, you get them out and do what you can, because you would hope that they would do it for you if you were in their situation. It's nice that we have that brotherly bond 7,000 miles away from home. But what about home? Home, you can barely find people that you have the same agreements with. So why should I, as a 28-year-old, go fight on behalf of the United States, which is so divided at this point that we're barely holding on to it as it is? And you mean to tell me I'm supposed to be shipping my ass away 7,000 miles, 5,000 miles, whatever it is, to some distant foreign land, trying to fix their conflict, while we're over here in shambles, barely able to hold on to things as they are? Sorry, I don't think that's going to happen. We have to resolve so many more domestic things before I feel like we can even do that. And plus, If we do go to war again, there's nothing stopping us from having the economic explosion. And plus, if we do go fight one of those wars, well, we're going to have to raise money for that somehow. We've kind of borrowed our ass off with the whole Afghanistan forever wars. How the fuck would we even dream of paying for it? And also holding on to the economic system that has some semblance of sanity. You can't have both. You can't have another forever war or another war that's going to cost $1 billion when we can't even pay off the Bush wars that we should never have been in the first place. So why am I going to go represent my country on behalf of that when we can't even get our shit together domestically? Do you think that those 16 and 17-year-olds that are kind of borderline and look like they could be 18 are really going to try to do everything in their power to sneak into the army and armed forces and fight? Is that sense of patriotism and upholding the U.S. and bond that we still have in society and agreement really still being upheld in 2025? Of course not. Most of us would say no at this point. So with that being said, why am I going to go fight in a foreign land when we still have so many domestic issues? Think about the disunity that we live in today. I've gone over many of these things on my channel, so I'm not going to go into them crazily here. But at this point, if they're going to try to get us to like be drafted, for example, I know it hasn't happened in over 50 years at this point. Now, let's pretend that the draft did happen. They want us to go fight some BS war because nobody wants to do it, and so they have to enact the draft. I think we're better off just going to jail than doing that. There's no way you're going to get my ass to willingly fly 5,000 miles away or 8,000 miles away or whatever to go fight in some conflict when we are domestically struggling as we are. So with that being said, I guess this is the final note. While Vietnam and Korea are very difficult for me to kind of make a decision like, was it justified, especially when you're that early into the Cold War, I think that those are infinitely more justified trying to destroy communism and get rid of it in the overt fashion rather than these like Bush wars, which were just like Iraq, Afghanistan, let's get oil and then create weapons of mass destruction that don't exist. And those were totally just like borderline crimes against humanity. I mean, the amount of suffering that we caused over there was very immense. And the only thing we feel is just like a crappier dollar for it. Yes, we had people who died over there, but in comparison to what they suffered, not where I want to be. So maybe a war with like China and Taiwan and trying to fight on behalf of Taiwan would be like honorable, but do we really want to send our troops over there and our boys and our friends, our families? Not really. And especially not while things are so fucked up. So there you go. There's my kind of long rant. I was probably pretty repetitive during this, but I hope that I hammered home the point that if the government asks you to fight on behalf of them today, I would just say, go fuck yourself. You want to send me to jail? You're better off doing that. Because there's no way you're going to get my ass to go fight somewhere for some stupid shit. I mean, for fuck's sake, like think about what victory would even look like sometimes. Let's pretend that we did beat Korea or like another place that had communism as their main goal, yet we were able to install capitalism there. Well, what happens when the people don't necessarily want it? I mean, that's kind of one of the asymmetries that was going on with Iraq and Afghanistan. It's like, okay, well, we can go try to spread democracy, but the local people really aren't all that receptive to it, not because it's like they don't want it. It's just they're so much more like tribal. And again, this is like my understanding of it, but they're so much more tribal, and even though they're like the country of Iraq or Afghanistan, they're way more like almost feudal in the sense that things are like so much more displaced. For example, if you're in like the capital like Kabul and you're in like the mountains of like another place, those two places have very little to do with each other, and so that like distance is like displacing them and they contribute almost nothing to society because they have nothing to do with each other, right? So how is this group of people who have nothing to do with each other suddenly supposed to uphold like a democratic society or have like a constitutional republic where they vote and have things in common? Like, even though they're a country, they're like very much different in a lot of ways culturally, while the United States is at least semi-consistent along its cultural norms, or at least used to be. So yeah, that's the main thing. Like, what happens if we win and then the local people don't want what we have to offer? Well, we can't just build it up. And you mean to tell me when we send all our troops over there, put all these resources and went $8, $9, $10 trillion in debt, gave them something they couldn't even utilize because they're not congruent or able to use that kind of system in a way that makes sense for them, and it's not something they would want because they have nothing in common with each other? Well, we just fucking lost all these people to do something that didn't even pay off in the end. There was no payoff. There's like no payoff in all of this. So if a society is not receptive and doesn't want these sorts of things, even though they may be good in our eyes and they may be the right way to do things, we say right, they might just not be receptive. Like, let's pretend we won in Vietnam and for whatever reason the North Vietnamese and didn't want to have capitalism, so the second that the US was like not pointing a gun in their faces and saying you must have democracy, well, they go to communism the second we step out. So if the people aren't receptive to it, then what's the point? Maybe sometimes we have to look at this like this. We can't have a winning solution here, and we have to accept that they're not going to be ones that want to do it on their own. The society has has to be in a place where they want to uphold it on their own. You can take away the drug pipe from someone, but it entirely depends on what they do on their own when you're not looking and monitoring it and helicoptering the situation. If they're going to hit that pipe on their own, then there's no point in taking it away from them. It would help to take them away in the short term, but they're going to keep continually doing it the second that you're not looking. So if there's no benefit, and you putting your energy into that situation, into someone who's not receptive to trying to get rid of their drug problem, well, it's a lose-lose. They have to be of the mindset where they're coming to the terms on their own volition, and they genuinely want to do it. So there you go. Those are some of my thoughts on wars, especially the ones since World War II. Hopefully this was informative and you might have learned something. I realized that I didn't cover a lot of things in detail necessarily, especially when it came to Korea and Vietnam. I suppose I could do another video about that some other time. I mean, I love going through stuff like this. Maybe I could do like an in-depth Korean War coverage or a Vietnam thing if you guys wanted. Those kind of refreshers are always fun to jump through. Nerdy stuff like that brings me joy, and especially if I can share it with other people, then why wouldn't I? So again, hopefully you learned something from this, and hopefully I've put something in your pipe that you can smoke now and think about with regards to our own society and war and conflict and the outcomes and the nature of war and how it's changed from the early 60s and 50s versus the 90s versus the last 25 years.